Hi again. In The Rise of Adventism by Edwin Scott Gaustad, the editor that is, there's a chapter here on spiritualism, chapter 6 of the book. L. Laurence Moore of Cornell University wrote this chapter. Octavius Brooks Frothingham, whose religious beliefs owed a great deal to Massachusetts transcendentalism, looked favorably upon any movement that contributed to the woes of 19th century American Calvinism. The phenomenal vogue of spiritualism, which began in this country in the 1850s, tested the limits of his tolerance. Its adherents, he felt, demonstrated bovine complacency in the face of monumental trickery and fraud. Once more, he said, even had all their cherished mediumistic performances proved genuine, spiritualists expectantly holding hands around a circle in a darkened room manifested no higher desire than to catch a voyeur's glance at a world more filled with teasing, troublesome, meddlesome beings than this one. Nonetheless, Frothingham did acknowledge the blow that spiritualism delivered to what he regarded as a petrified religious orthodoxy. When spiritualism appeared, Frothingham wrote, the theological atmosphere was still. The communions were unbroken. The people looked stupidly acquiescent in the doctrines that were taught them by their clergy. Unitarianism and Universalism were unpopular. Then, in 1850, the Fox sisters came to New York City, and mediums materialized all over the country to duplicate their success. All of a sudden, Frothingham continued, the rappings are heard, tables begin to tip, mahogany vibrates, and one whole side of the calm mountain of the common mind comes down in a fierce avalanche and rushes across the continent, depopulating churches, desolating homes of faith, scattering communions, burying shrines, and covering the fair gardens of religion with heaps of ruin. End of quote. Any attempt to place spiritualism properly in the context of 19th century American religious thought faces several problems. Frothingham's remarks, as we shall see, are not without historical validity. Certainly they do not exaggerate the widespread public interest in spiritualist phenomena from the early 1850s to the end of the 19th century. Newspapers and all sorts of specialized and popular journals devoted enormous attention to spiritualism. Spirit seekers filled large halls in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and San Francisco to hear spiritualist lecturers. Rural camp meetings organized by leading professional mediums attracted tens and thousands of people. Nevertheless, because of the weak institutional base of the movement, we have no reliable figures on the number of spiritualists in the 19th century. Because 19th century Americans went to seances with a variety of motives, we're not even entirely sure whom we should call a spiritualist. Much of the interest in the reported spirit voices related only tangentially to the fierce theological controversy which spiritualism aroused and which Frothingham welcomed. Emma Hardinge Britton, an English-born actress who became one of the leading public mediums in the 19th century, judged that the majority of spiritualism's 19th century American adherents regarded it as a religion separate in all respects from any existing sect. She was wrong, and her later disquiet with the course of the movement was confession to her error. George Lawton was also wrong when he asserted, in his exhaustive study of spiritualist religion published in the 1930s, that spiritualism presents an elaborate, definite, and as nearly articulated a system of religious beliefs and practices as can be found anywhere in the history of thought. Samuel B. Britton, a leading spiritualist editor of the mid and late 19th century, came closer to the truth. According to his lament, Americans in the 19th century, intrigued by spiritualist claims, would go anywhere to see a table turned for the 40th time, but they would neither occupy an hour in a rational effort to comprehend the philosophy of the fact, nor invest a single dollar in the practical application of the truth to any human interest. Spirit investigators in the 19th century did take seances seriously, but many of them saw no connection between a seance and a religious ceremony. They did not typically pay to witness mediums' performances in order to be inspired, or to repent, or to be filled with awe of a divine presence. They did not attend seances to learn how God intended them to live their lives. They did not even go to see the proof of immortality. At least once they were convinced of the reality of spirits. They did not go back again and again, as they did for that reason. Most men and women went to seances to be consoled. They hoped for a message from a deceased spouse or child in an age that still lived very close to death, but had lost some of the certain comforts of traditional theology. The seance provided an important means to relieve acute grief. The spirits offered consolation of another kind as well. They gave positive reinforcement to unpopular men and women who supported unpopular causes or pursued socially anathematized courses of conduct. John Shoebridge Williams, an ex-civil engineer and road builder, took his domestic problems to his everlastingly understanding spirit voices for over 15 years. "It is not a consolation," he wrote, "for a man of my years and sensibilities, who has been as much misunderstood as I have been, to find he is better understood by spirits and angels than by men." Arguably, of course, the desire for consolation is one aspect of a religious faith. The point here is merely that people often sought the consolation of spiritualist circles without letting it interfere with their already settled religious beliefs. People also went to seances for less emotional reasons. They were curious, they sought entertainment, or they wanted to observe what they believed to be a scientific demonstration of little understood natural forces. The spirits, as they managed to increase the variety of their manifestations beyond the rappings heard first in the presence of the Fox sisters, eagerly demonstrated their practical uses. E.J. French relied on them to communicate with his brother in California. According to his testimony before a weekly conference of spiritualists at Clinton Hall in New York City, spiritual telegraphy was faster and cheaper than the mails. In addition, he said, by following the directions of the spirits of near relatives and well-known physicians, he had saved himself from a railroad accident, subdued a vicious dog, and healed the paralysis of an ailing mother and a grandfather. His daughter, using the gift of a similar ability to hear spirit voices, relieved herself of a toothache. A number of the early mediums advertised themselves as clairvoyant physicians, and some men and women later identified with mind cure movements, Mary Baker Eddy being the most famous, had early encounters with spiritualist practices. However, the mind cure people almost always at some point repudiated spiritualism as being overly materialistic and concerned with external cures. Their own practices stressed getting in tune with the infinite rather than drugs prescribed at spirit direction or magnetic healing. Probably the majority of people who attended public spiritualist demonstrations in the 19th century judged the meetings good or bad according to the level of supernormal, not necessarily divine powers, evinced by the medium. Spectators watched the proceedings with their eyes open, not with their heads bowed in reverent devotion. An interested Southern visitor to a spiritualist gathering at Apollo Hall in New York in 1870 detected none of the trappings she associated with a religious service. Quote, "I was struck with the hum of conversation and the lack of gravity which befits a house of worship. It was good so far as it went, but there was no religion there. That night there was no prayer offered, no invocation made. The audience, I cannot call them a congregation, dispersed without a blessing and applauded frequently as at any other lecture." End of quote. Many leading professional mediums, including Kate and Margaret Fox, hesitated to make definitive claims about the origins of the various mediumistic displays. The advertisements for their public performances clearly aimed at titillating the detective instincts of men and women rather than their religious faith. Maybe spirits were involved, maybe not. The public paid its money for the privilege of solving a puzzle. The difficulties of trying to probe the impact of spiritualism upon religious thought in America go beyond these secular aspects of its general appeal. The men and women who did attach primary significance to the religious dimensions of the spirit messages, and these people are our main concern in this analysis, never reach much of a consensus about matters of fundamental significance. Perhaps a majority of self-styled spiritualist lecturers and editors viewed their work in the meetings they convened as constituting a separate and rival force to existing Christian denominations, and in many cases to Christianity itself. The two longest-lived periodicals of the spiritualist movement, Banner of Light and Religio-Philosophical Journal, both encouraged spiritualists to distinguish their attitudes from those of organized Christianity. When Isaac Rain insisted that spiritualism had a basis that is separate and different from that of the Christian church, or of any church extant, he was saying nothing exceptional. On the other hand, many believers in the spiritualist phenomena made a large point of calling themselves Christian spiritualists. They either retained their loyalty to whatever denomination they happened to be in before they became convinced of the reality of spirit communication, or joined in worship services whose communing spirits taught some version of the divinity of Christ. Without question, many of those who attended spiritualist Sunday meetings in the 19th century belonged to other churches. James Richardson and John Pierpont were two prominent Unitarian ministers who managed to champion spiritualist claims without altering what they viewed as their basic Christian position. Robert Hare, a highly regarded though aging American scientist, was one of several celebrated exponents of spiritualist belief in the 1850s who credited the spirits for his conversion to Christianity. These Christian spiritualists often complained bitterly about the direction others were pushing the movement. William Fishbough, who was one of the first to stress the religious implications of a belief in communicating spirits, was by 1853 already thoroughly disillusioned with spiritualist leadership in New York City. New York, he warned, is eminently a superficial, sensual, and practically infidel place, and there are comparatively few spiritualists here who acknowledge the Lord and his providential rule, either in theory or practice. End of quote. Gerrit Smith, the Liberty Party leader whose strong abolitionist views received support from spirit voices, tempered his belief in spirit communication by saying, "I cannot deny that spiritualism is fraught with great evil to those who are foolish enough to welcome it as a new religion and a substitute for Christianity." I'll put in a link to destructive religious groups and their characteristics.